This lecture will cover the chapter knowledge, and it will be covered in two parts. The first part is going to cover all of the models that have been developed to help explain how it is that we organize and store semantic information. The second part of the chapter will cover individual ideas around how we determine which items go into particular categories. The ideas around how information is stored has to do with this idea that general knowledge is categorized in some sort of semantic way that might be helpful for quick retrieval later. So the idea is that initially, potentially the brain uses the hierarchy, which is something that most natural categories have. Natural categories such as animals are broken into, for example, in this picture, birds, then owls, then different types of owls. So the idea was that seems fast and economical, so potentially the brain stores semantic information in that way as well. So some evidence around what might support this hierarchical view is that people that have brain damage tend to lose their ability to categorize information in this way. Alzheimer's patients have a hard time sorting categorical information regarding a grocery store. So instead of getting all the frozen foods first and then the condiments next and the vegetables, they might be scattered in their approach and get cereal, then run over and get vegetables, then come back and get condiments. So it's less organized. There are other deficits specific to some individuals. This guy's called the fruit and veggie guy, but the idea is that he had deficits in his ability to categorize fruit and vegetables, whereas other items he categorized just fine. So it does suggest in these sorts of patients where there's brain damage due to stroke that people have lost certain categories of semantic information as opposed to semantic information as a whole. Another example is, you can see Collins and Quinlan were the first ones to propose what's called the hierarchical network model. This is important that you understand this, so take note. This is the idea that concepts can be arranged in these very rigid, very strict categories, such as animals have skin, can move around, eat, and breathe, as in one level of this hierarchy. The next level would be bird, which also has certain attributes, and the next level would be canary. The idea here was that anything on one level would be responded to or retrieved from memory at the same speed, meaning that if I were to ask you about a bird versus a fish, you should be equally quick to retrieve that information. Whereas if I were to ask you about a canary, given that we were first talking about animals, it would take you longer, because the idea was that you should traverse two nodes, meaning you'd have to jump from animal to bird, bird to canary. The way this was initially tested is that they used what were called sentence verification tasks. So they would give somebody, like, a mango is an animal, and measure how long it took them to make that response. Or a chicken is a bird, how long did it take to make that response? And saying true or false took a certain amount of time. And what they found is that the closer the concept was to the previous level, the quicker a person could respond. So this is an example here where you can see category sentences, a canary is a canary, would be no level of jump, whereas a canary is an animal is a 2-level jump, and that took longer. And this is also consistent with the feature sentences, as you can see, specific things about the canary. And here's the data, and you can see from the data that the reaction time, which goes up on the left-hand side, is slower as the number of links, which is along the bottom, gets further away. So a canary has skin requires 2 jumps and takes longer than a canary can sing, which would be on the same category level. So this all sounds great, but the problem is that people were not verifying these particular categories at the right speed all the time. So you can see that if you had a dog named Mango and they asked, is Mango an animal? You might say yes, which you should instead be able to reject that. Or when you think about, is a dog a mammal? People don't think about dogs as mammals. People think about dogs as animals. So that took longer than it should relative to the number of jumps expected. So the idea was that people associate certain things more closely with certain items, and this is called the strength of association, which also led to what's called a typicality effect, and this is really important. A typicality effect is typical category members are verified or retrieved quicker than atypical category members. So an example would be people can say a robin is a bird much faster than an ostrich is a bird because the robin is a birdie bird. Well, another thing that was discussed about the same time frame was multidimensional scaling, and this is not a model, so keep that in mind. First, we just talked about the hierarchical network model. This is not a model, however. This is just a different approach to determine how people make decisions about semantic information and try to create something that was tied to what's called psychological space. So instead of the hierarchical network model, which tried to make things as sort of a yes or a no, black or white, Roger Shepard actually thought about this as maybe more fluid, that there is a range of information that makes something a category. So I just wanted you to see this. This is an example that we would do in class, where you can see if I asked you to tell me how similar football and boxing, tennis and football are, people would rate those on a scale of 1 to 6. And people use different things to determine how things are related. In the case that I just did, I used team and individual and contact versus non-contact. So however, instead of forcing people to make decisions about different category members, I look at the data and then determine what things they used to make those decisions. So here, based on the similarity ratings, you could tell that I used contact or aggressiveness on the one hand, level of aggressiveness. On the other hand, I used whether or not something was team or individual. So you can see here that baseball is the most non-contact and the least team sport. Oh, the most team sport, sorry. This is an example of people trying to categorize faces, and you can see the continuum here is male, female, Asian, Caucasian. And others also did follow-up studies where they used birds and mammals, and the results ended up being about the same. So what you should take from this multi-dimensional scaling approach is that people do not use these sort of binary yes or no ideas when they think about categories. They actually think about categories as being sort of continuous. So there's a lot of information lost by trying to force people to categorize items into one thing or the other. So it was a way to look at psychological space and how people really approach categories. The next model, as a follow-up to the hierarchical network model, is Collins and Loftus. This was called the spreading activation model. This is also very important. So instead of a hierarchy now, the idea is that activation and retrieval of information actually occurs in these related nodes. So things that we have lots of experience with are close together. Things that we do not necessarily think about together are very far apart. These things are experience driven. So for example, I'm from Arizona. There the fire trucks are a lime green. So if I were thinking about a fire truck, I wouldn't necessarily think red right away. However, prior to this, you probably didn't think about fire engines as being lime green. So this is also individualized, and instead of being a hierarchy now, we now have a web-based design. The important thing about this approach also is it could explain typicality effects. If you remember, the hierarchical network model had a problem with strength of association ideas. Here, this can handle that. So if I respond fast to red and fire, it's because my experience associates those two items. Therefore, typical category members can easily be retrieved quickly, and that's explained by this model. One way that this also can be tested with the typicality effects is priming, semantic priming models. And so an example here is if somebody is primed with something unrelated like bread, and then measure how long it takes them to respond to the word nurse as an actual word, it's going to take them longer than if we prime them with doctor and then ask them to respond whether or not the target word nurse is a word, or if you have actually no prime at all and it's hash marks, and then to see how quickly they respond to nurse. So you can see with this data here that if it's a related prime, people are much faster to respond to the target word nurse than if it's an unrelated prime.